Well, Shabbat Shalom and welcome. This is Torah Study for a Shabbos morning. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein, joined together by my dear friend and teacher from South Florida, Rabbi Mark Gelman. Mark, Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat shalom, my dear friend, and mazel tov on the baby and on
Thank
the bris
you.
and
Thank
the
you. We
whole.
have a new grandson. His bris was this week, and we wish everyone our gratitude for sharing this simcha with us. And we're grateful that he's healthy and his mom is healthy.
Yeah, refuah shlema for mommy.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This week is the denouement, the climax of the book of Exodus. It is perhaps the most cinematic of any of the Torah portions in the entire Torah, because if you haven't read the book, you've certainly seen the movie. This is the story of the final exodus from Egypt. The last plague comes, Pharaoh kicks us out. The Torah portion begins by saying that God didn't want to take us the quick way through the desert. He took us the long way, which meant that we had to confront the Red Sea, or Yam Suf, the Reed Sea. So we were slaves, our parents were slaves, our grandparents slaves. Suddenly this fellow Moses shows up and says, pack your things, we're leaving. And we ran out of Egypt, ran so quickly we didn't have time to order a pizza. We had to take matzah with us. And finally, after 3 days of running, we stop at the Red Sea to catch our breath. And we think for maybe a moment, maybe just for a moment, we're actually free when we hear the hoofbeats of Pharaoh's chariots behind us. Pharaoh has hardened his heart an 11th time and is chasing us to destroy us here at the sea. And we find ourselves trapped between the coming death of Pharaoh's chariots on the one side and the blocking of the sea on the other side. And we cry out to Moses. And it's wonderful, Mark. You'll appreciate this because when Jews are in catastrophe, they become incredibly articulate with the cynicism that is so amazing. Like, there's always time for a kvetch. And so they say to him, were there not enough graves in Egypt that you brought us to die in the wilderness? Like, and poor Moshe says to the people, basically he says, shut up and watch. And then he turns to God and says, what do I do? And God says, stop praying, move, hold your arm over the sea will split, and you will go through on dry land. And once and for all, the people will see that I am in charge of this. And Moses holds his arm over the sea splits, the people walk through. There can be miracles if you believe, as the song goes. And on the other side, the sea comes back. Pharaoh is drowned. All the chariots are drowned. And the people Israel stand there on the far side of the sea. And I think what happens is they turn around and they see the vast open expanse of the wilderness. And suddenly it really does dawn on them that they are free. And they sing a song to God, Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai, who is like God. And that is the beginning of Jewish history. This is the emblematic moment. It is the climactic moment. According to the tradition, all of us were there. All of us have to remember that moment because this is the moment that gives us our vision of history and our place in the world. This is the moment that Jewish faith and Jewish hope is born. Mark, tell me how you celebrate this moment.
Well, first of all, that's exactly right and beautifully said. And it's interesting to me that at that nodal moment, at that formative moment, a phrase is said that is not said anywhere else in the Torah. And that is Vayaminu Badonai Moshe Abdo. Vayaminu Badonai. They believed, they had faith in God. And it's interesting that the word for faith does not derive from what you'd imagine the Hebrew word emet, which is truth. That would be, you'd think that would be the right derivative for faith, but it isn't. V'ya'aminu, from which we, of course, derive the word amen at the end of every one of our prayers, it means trust. So faith is not the truth of things. Faith is the trust in things. It's a fascinating and brilliant understanding of faith. So right then, the people believed in God. They had not yet been challenged by the wilderness, which would bring out more kvetching. They had not understood what was ahead of them. They understood what was just behind them, which was now a drowned army and a complete and total vindication of the Exodus. But there's an interesting little clue right in this nodal moment about faith. And I think we should talk about what is faith, because here it is. And because, after all, the Torah is a book of faith, the foundation of our faith. It's not only the foundation of our history. You speak about this wonderfully and often, about how it's our narrative, and it is. But it's also the foundation of what we believe. And let's not forget, that's why we are Jews. We're not just Jews because we had a history. That's why French people are French people. They have the common history. But it's because we have a faith that binds us. So anyway, in the middle of this, there's just a description of how the people went through the sea. And in 1422, it says that they walked, b'toch hayam v'yavasha, in the midst of the sea, on dry land. Okay, that's how they went through. Then in 1429, we have the same, almost the same verse, but it's changed. And it says, they went through the sea, and they walked through the sea, b'yavasha v'toch hayam. They went through the sea on dry land in the midst of the sea. So why not just say it the same way in both cases? In the one case, it's they went into the sea on dry land. In the second, it's they went on dry land into the sea. And I think it's a clue to the two types of faith. That is a lesson for all of us who study the Torah. The first is epitomized by, I think it's the first midrash that rabbinical students are taught, because all of them know this midrash, and it's famous for that reason. It's the story of Nachshon ben Aminadav, who walks into the Red Sea at this point, in a way forcing God's hand. The water comes up to his neck and his mouth and his nose. And just before he drowns in the sea, to prevent Nachshon from drowning, God splits the sea. So, and you could add to that, before Moses is called by God, he kills the taskmaster, showing his courage and his commitment to his people. So the first kind of faith is, you have to do something first. You can't sit around waiting on your tuchus for God to do something for you. You have to do something first. Faith is God's response to your reaching out to God in gratitude and love. The second type of faith is v'yavasha v'toch hayam. People who say, look, who at the Red Sea said, it's dry. Okay, we can go. It's dry. I see it's dry. That's the second kind of faith. When God does something, okay, then I'll have faith if God does something.
Right.
The problem with the second kind of faith, which makes it an inferior faith, or I would rather say a more fragile
I would say
faith.
it's more ordinary, actually.
Good, I like that.
Because
Ordinary.
it doesn't have the courage of the first one, right?
That's absolutely right. And it's also one in which, if you say, I'm waiting for God to do something, the truth of the matter is, God already did something and you're just ignoring it.
Right.
God let you take that last breath you took.
Well,
God let you wake up in the morning. God let you be hugged by someone who loves you.
You know the
God,
joke, Mark? The joke of the guy was late for a terribly important appointment and he can't find a parking place. And he prays really hard. He says, Master of the world, dear God, give me a parking place. I promise to fulfill your will. I'll keep kosher. I'll daven every way. And then suddenly a parking place right in front of the building opens up. He says, Oh, never mind, God, I found one.
yeah, I don't need your help.
I don't need it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So those are the two kinds of faith, and this story reminds us of it. And and I think part of the problem that we face as a modern Jewish community, particularly now after October 7th, is the search for faith and hope.
Mm,
You say, oh my God, we're all depressed, we're all fearful on every level.
right.
But what it really is reminding us is that it's always been that way. There's always things to be afraid of, but faith is what we turn to in these times of difficulty. It's to use the great teacher of Valley Beth Shalom's teachers, Mordecai Kaplan. One of my favorite Kaplanian vorts was when he said, "It is hell to live without hope, and religion saves people from hell." I love that. It is hell to live without hope.
I want to go back to the Nachshon story because I think I want to make this point stronger. Your first kind of faith, right? So
Mhm.
for everyone remembers the Nachshon story, the story is that when Moses holds his arm over the sea, in the Torah, that's when the sea splits. That's what makes the moment so cinematic. And so in the Haggadah, when we tell the story again at Passover, the story in the Haggadah points out that it wasn't by an angel and it wasn't by a seraph and it wasn't by a messenger, but God himself redeemed us from Egypt. Then the rabbis get hold of this story and they put something in the story which is not present in the Torah at all. They actually squeeze it between the words and between the lines. And the episode is that when Moses holds his arm over the sea, nothing happens. And he does it again and nothing happens. So imagine he's beginning to schwitz, right? He reads the instructions on the stick. Got the right stick. I'm standing in the right place. And nothing happens. And he can't figure out why the promised miracle isn't happening. And the people are getting nervous and Pharaoh's getting closer. And the idea is that nobody can figure out what's happening except one guy. And the Midrash tells us it's Nachshon ben Aminadav, the prince of the tribe of Judah. Now, again, none of this is in the Torah. His
Right.
name is in a genealogy, but that's it. And it says that Nachshon understood that God was waiting and that what he does is he pushes to the front of the line and jumps in the water. And his family says, fool, you don't know how to swim, come back. And he goes out till it covers his waist. And his children beg him to come back. And then everyone watches as the water covers his chest. And then when he goes under the water and breathes one more breath, only then does the sea split. It's a story that the rabbis introduce because they have a different model of redemption. And what you pointed out, a different model of faith, right? The model of redemption that's in the text of the Bible is that God redeems, and all we have to do is wait for God's redemption. The rabbis understood if you wait for God's redemption, you'll wait forever. You will wait there on the banks of the Nile, the banks of the Red Sea, and you will never be redeemed. The only way for redemption to come is for someone to jump in the water. That's the only way it's going to happen. And you're saying in the model you've offered us, the only way for faith to come is to have the courage to take a step forward and to say, I take responsibility at this moment. In Israel, one of the things that's happening in Israel, one of the stories that is being told again and again, that gives so much faith is how the Israeli people now have gathered about each other to support and protect and help each other, especially in the absence of the government, which was rather incompetent, not just during the catastrophe, but immediately afterwards. It was the community itself that gathered together to provide support and help and transportation and all sorts of things. And the idea that we have the courage to step forward is the only way that redemption comes to the world. And what you've offered us in terms of faith is it's the only way to gain a sense of faith in the world is to begin with your own capacity to bring redemption. It's almost like you feel faith in your fingers before you feel it in your heart. That
Yeah.
I think is a beautiful model of faith. It's a very profound model of faith.
So here's my question. Are you hearing in the literature, reportage, the evidence coming out of Israel, and in the diaspora as well? Are you hearing this message? Because I'm not hearing the message. We have to trust in God. We have to hope for God's redemption in this difficult time. I'm hearing, the Israeli army will help and we'll defeat them, or there'll be a negotiation. All sorts of stuff I'm hearing, but I'm not hearing the response of a community of faith. And that disturbs me because ultimately you don't know what the earthly powers are going to produce, and you don't know what they're going to do. But what you do know is that there's a covenant that we have with God, and that God took us out of Egypt, and that God has chosen us and protects us, and that is forever, and that is real. And this is the time to remember that. I think my favorite theologian is a Christian theologian, actually, because he was so warm and so brilliant and such a universal man. And that was C.S. Lewis, who basically kept England's soul together during World War II. And of course, was a friend of Tolkien and wrote the Chronicles of Narnia and the whole thing. Lewis, who was an atheist and then converted to Christianity and became just this powerful, loving theologian, wrote these words: I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. That's perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Eddie, that's perfect. It's a perfect description of faith.
I have not heard people speak of faith that way. I have heard people question, you know,
Yes.
and the faith that I have heard is more faith in the people. The fact that a people can sustain a catastrophe as horrendous as October 7th and not give up, and the fact that there is such a swelling of help coming from every quarter of Israeli society um, to rebuild and to restore and to reinforce, that I have heard quite a bit.
Yes. But this is the key point. After the Holocaust, we heard Ani Ma'amin. Ani Ma'amin. I have faith. I have complete faith. B'viat HaMashiach, in the coming of the Messiah. V'afal pi sheyitmamea, and even though he's delayed, im kol zeh ani ma'amin, even so, I believe. That is what happened after the Holocaust. But we don't hear that after October 7th.
No, but after the Holocaust, there were just as many Jews who said, I can't believe anymore. And what happened at
Why?
that
But
point, the belief
fair
in,
point. A fair point. But we also had the powerful articulation of faith. We, everything from Fackenheim's 614th commandment, don't grant Hitler any posthumous victories, all sorts of stuff. And Wiesel and Tell the Story and Never Again. I'm just saying, this seems to me to be a time when we need faith more than ever. And the catastrophe of October 7th only pinpoints how weak faith is in our own time.
well, I'm not going to argue that faith is weak, but it isn't weak. But I think that what you're seeing, what you saw after the Holocaust and what you're seeing now is, I think, in some ways the same phenomenon. What is happening now is that people are saying, I don't know where God is during a catastrophe, but I know where I need to be. I know what I need to do. An upswelling of support, protection, of concern, of activism, of commitment on behalf of Jews around the world, and behalf of Jews, especially Jews in Israel, what they're doing for each other. And which is exactly what you said before. That's the Nachshon moment. I jump in the water. I don't know where God is now, but I know that something is asked of me, and I jump in the water. And that's what Israelis are doing. And I think many of us in the diaspora are doing as well. Same thing after the war, after the Second World War. Yeah, there were some Jews who reinforced their faith and said, Ani Ma'amin. But there were many more who said, I can't believe in that God anymore. And that's why they turned to Zionism. That's when Zionism became the dominant philosophy of Western Jews, because it was the Jewish people standing up for its own destiny. That's where you had Jews becoming political. Jews standing up for their own civil liberties. I think it's really it's a substantiation of what you mentioned before. It's that first kind of faith. It's a jump into history, accept responsibility, express your commitment. And then in the wake of that, when you stand back on Shabbos and reflect on it, that's when faith comes in behind you. That's when faith arrives after that. There's another midrash, by the way, which I learned, and I think it was in a book by Gene Borowitz. And he says there's a midrash, and I don't know what the source is, but I remember reading the book. He said, "Vayaminu b'Adonai b'Moshe Avdo," and somewhere in the Gemara, the rabbis, some rabbi asked the question. He said, "Listen, why did the Torah have to tell us this? Of course they believed in God, and of course they trusted Moses. They just saw the Red Sea split. They just experienced this great, incredible cinematic miracle. And before that, they experienced all the 10 plagues. Of course they believe." And the answer was that the reason it said that was because after having been slaves for so long, after having seen so much atrocity and so much pain, the fact that they were willing to step forward into history, step forward into the water, so the fact that they were willing to take that step and to say yes to hope and no to despair was a greater miracle than the splitting of the sea.
Yes.
Right. And I think the same thing is happening now. I think it happened after the war. The fact that the Jewish people didn't pack up and say no more after the Shoah, that they heard what Fackenheim was writing about. Emil Fackenheim was a German philosopher, moved to Canada after the war, and then eventually ended up in Israel. And in his famous monograph that he wrote after the Six-Day War in 1970, he wrote it. He said that we are now hearing a new commandment, the 614th commandment, which is Jews must not give Hitler a posthumous victory. Jews cannot let Hitler win. And one of the elements of his development of that idea was we can't give up faith. We can't give up hope. We can't fall into despair. We can't fall into mysticism, which pulls us out of the world. We have to be engaged in our history. And I think that what Fackenheim was describing there is exactly the attitude of Jews worldwide after the Shoah. We didn't know exactly what to believe. We didn't know exactly how to embrace a God after such a catastrophe. We didn't know what to teach our children, but we knew one thing, that we weren't going to give up, and that we had to care for each other. And in caring for each other, in stepping forward as Jews and not giving up our Jewishness, that was the greatest expression of faith that one could have.
Yeah, I agree. And I hope you're right. And I'm just not hearing the theological hopefulness.
Because we haven't had the Shabbos after the catastrophe yet. Because we're
It's
still
still the
in it.
war, you think.
You're
It's
still in it. You're in a war. There's 130 something hostages. The country is still in turmoil. Its government is still in turmoil. There isn't yet the moment when people can breathe and say, okay, what do we learn about ourselves from this moment? That hasn't happened yet.
Well, that's a fair point, but I think there's never a point at which faith is not appropriate. That's what you're describing is the second kind of faith. Let's wait till the ground is dry and then we can have faith.
No, no, it's let's wait till we get across the sea and then we'll turn back and say, oh my God, what just happened to us? It's still the first kind of faith. It's just that
Maybe.
it
I
hasn't
hope you're
found the
right.
rhythm.
I hope you're right. The interpretation of that midrash that you mentioned that I was taught is actually one of my favorites, and that's how did the people after getting through the sea still not believe? Because there were those who didn't believe. And how could they not? They saw everything, the plagues and the redemptions and the sea. They said they walked through the sea on dry land, but they never looked up.
Yeah,
So all they ever saw was mud.
right.
And that's the advice that I would give to people who are in great despair right now and searching for hope. Look up. Look up. That's
Mhm.
what I'm really saying. We need to hear theological voices. Um, a medieval Christian theologian, St. Peter, Julian Eymard, wrote, faith is to believe what you do not see. And the reward of this faith is to see what you believe.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, and that I think is where we're at. You have to believe something even if you don't see it. And that what I'm believing now is there are no Hittites, there are no Amalekites, there are no, pharaohs. They're all gone, and there will be a time when there will be no Hamas, and they will be gone because evil is always overextends itself. Evil always is defeated, um, and of course, we suffer while it is being defeated, but we hold deeply, deeply the belief in faith and hope in difficult times. And that I think is our job as rabbis. I think it's our task as a people. And and I believe in it. And I believe this Torah portion, this one, Vayaminu Badonai, is the one that came at exactly the right time, around 100 days, a little after 100 days, to remind us, look, don't worry. Don't worry, I'm with you. I've always been with you, and I will continue to be with you and save you and bring you into the land.
That's beautiful. And I would just add one more line, which is don't worry, but don't stop moving forward.
Walk into the water.
Walk into the water and keep walking across the desert because there is yet a journey ahead of us, and it's a difficult one, and
Indeed.
requires everyone's deepest commitment. And that's where we are right now. Mark, thank you. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Happy Shabbos Shira to everybody.